Invisible racism is the subtle, subversive, and deliberate informal and formal mechanism that allows unequal access to rewards, prestige, sanctions, status, and privileges based on racial hierarchies. Though invisible racism does not carry the weight of the law, traditions, norms, and customs typically uphold, justify, and obscure its operation. For instance, a white European is expected to outperform selected tasks, develop specific skills, excel in certain environments as compared to an African migrant. That is, invisible racism serves to explain such obvious racial outcomes as natural and normal. Alternatively, any deficiencies, lack of achievements, or failure to perform by one African migrant is similarly obscured, misdiagnosed, and misrepresented as a group failure. Invisible racism is a matter of how one's brain process of information is influenced by things they have seen, things they have experienced, and the way mainstream media has presented things. For instance, racialized minority groups, particularly African migrants or refugees living in Europe, are required to pay more to rent an apartment and are less likely to obtain key information regarding job opportunities. Whereas the systemically enhanced information, access, and assistance provided to white Europeans increase the likelihood of their success vis-a-vis the racialized African migrants or refugees. Alternatively, the selective enforcement of various laws, increased surveillance of certain laws, and the disparities in educational funding within African migrants or refugees communities increase the likelihood that they will experience greater levels of criminalization than white Europeans. Invisible racism operates and continues to remain deeply embedded in the social, economic, cultural, psychic, and political fabric of societies. Critical racial and ethnic studies continually attempt to understand the process by which systems of racialization are preserved, maintained, and perpetuated, and recognize that intersectionality of systems of racism further operate from the disadvantage point of the oppressed groups. For example, an African migrant who belongs to LGBTIQ+ community faces racial prejudices among the white Europeans, and at the same time, faces gender and/or sexual-based discrimination, both within the African migrant and white European communities. So such multiple dimensions and intersectionality of which race, gender, and sex are but different, operate interactively and systemically to produce and/or reproduce structures of exploitation, abuse, oppression, and discrimination. That is, white Europeans' political, social, and cultural institutions provide the situational context in which these dimensions interact. That is to say, either implicitly or explicitly, courts, policies, schools, churches, friendships, family networks, and media outlets all serve to preserve, perpetuate, and modify racial attitudes, gender and sexual norms, group formation, and the systems of racial, gender, and sexual exploitation, abuse, oppression, and discrimination in a dynamic, obscure, and mass process underlying invisible racism. Perpetuation of racism. In its genesis and perpetuation, invisible racism involves a common sense or a notion of normative processes. For example, while no one significantly questions the correctness of a white European man flying an airplane, some, if not most, automatically question the credentials of an African man flying an airplane, whereas an African man as a football or a basketball player is deemed common. It is also understandable and acceptable that that player should not be good in academic pursuits. The reality of this aspect is that systems produce differential expectations for different racial, gender, or sexual groups. These racial self-fulfilling prophecies are exemplified by the expectation that the white European students will do well in academic pursuits, compared to the African migrant students. This continued acceptance of excellence by one set of racialized individuals, and not for the other, is constantly in operation. So, who or what gets defined as legitimate representatives and representations of any racialized groups are an important dimension of invisible racism? That is, racial labels serve to determine who gets to claim normalcy or identity, or access to racialized rewards backed by racial profiling. Racial profiling is a systemic singling out of racial and ethnic minority groups for unequal negative sanctions that is well alive throughout Europe. While most recent research has been in terms of police and crime, A long history of racial profiling has and continues to be documented among migrants and refugees communities in all countries across Europe.